She took $50 to sabotage a blind date, but the man she was meant to trick captured her heart, and the bill was still warm from the palm that pressed it into hers when Mara stepped out into the rain-damp neon of 4th Street, the city smeared in reflections like a painting someone had breathed on and wiped with their sleeve, the air smelling of wet concrete and oranges sliced open at the fruit stand where the vendor was singing to himself in a language soft as a lullaby. She tucked the money into the pocket of her denim jacket and told herself it was just a prank, just a lark, just a way to make rent and keep the lights on for one more month, and not a choice that would reveal the small hairline cracks in her conscience that had been there all along, hidden until the world pressed hard enough to show them. She had been told his name was Julian, no last name, just that, as if a single proper noun could contain a whole life, and that he would be sitting at a table for two in Il Piccolo, an Italian place with a copper bar and a row of tiny lampshades that cast warm orange circles onto worn tabletops like halos you could put your elbows in. She was to get there before the real blind date arrived, sit down, pretend to be the woman he was meant to meet, and ruin it, be late, be strange, pick a fight over nothing, spill wine, make a scene, and somewhere in there, he'd flinch, he'd sour, and he'd leave with the impression that the person who had agreed to share bread and a bottle with him was awful, and his evening would be wrecked, and a particular woman who had given Mara that 50 would sleep better at night believing she had evened a score. No one ever paid for kindness like this, she had thought dryly when the woman Rena, with a smile like a thumbprint on silver, set the bill on the saucer and slid it across the table of the coffee shop where they met, explaining in a voice that was all immortality and lip gloss that Julian had ghosted her, or maybe she had ghosted him, the story diluted by time and resentment until neither of them could tell it without bending it toward their own hurt, and Mara had nodded, pretending she was the kind of person who took jobs like this every day, who didn't wake at 3 in the morning with her heart galloping and the ceiling fan turning above like a slow blade knife. Disappointment had its own weather system, she knew that too well from her mother's soft collapse into the couch after a shift at the nursing home, to the envelope of unpaid bills that had started to look like a stack of white flags, but she had never been the one to open an umbrella over someone else's rain, which made the wet weight of the night feel like a dare, like a scene she was walking into with someone else's lines in her mouth. And as she pushed open the glass door with the brass handle, everything smelled of garlic and basil and something toasted, and she realized the place was a film set for sincerity, all those couples leaning in and laughing softly into the steam of their bowls, the clink of forks gentle as wind chimes. The host with the smooth radio voice led her past the bar where bottles rose like stained glass, and there he was at a small table by the window, that window beaded with rain so it looked like the world was crying behind him, and he was folding and unfolding his hands in a way that told her he'd prepared for this, he'd thought about what to say, he'd chosen his shirt carefully and shaved with attention to the corner of his jaw where a neck would be visible, and for a second she wanted to turn and run, to vanish among the coats and leave the city to do its work without her, but his head lifted, his eyes searched and landed, and there was a flicker of relief like seeing the shape on the horizon you hoped was a ship and not a cloud, and it was too late to back out without turning into someone she'd never respect. Maya, he said, standing up at the same time she sat down so their motions misaligned. Comically, her knee bumping the table and making the water glasses chime, and his mouth twitched at the corner, the way some people's faces do when they are trying to contain something private. She almost said yes, almost slid fully into the lie Rena had designed for her, but the angle of his kindness made her reach for a compromise. Maybe, she said, and then added, sorry, I'm late, though she wasn't. You're right on time, he replied, and the way he said it made the sentence sound like a larger truth, as if everything in his life had taken a breath and arranged itself precisely for this moment, and she told herself to do the job, remember the plan, Sabotage. So she shrugged out of her jacket clumsily and let the sleeve knock over the small metal vessel of olive oil, the pale green pouring like a wound across the white tablecloth and toward his cuff, and he flinched back with a small whoa of surprise, then immediately laughed, grabbing napkins to dam the spill. "It's okay," he said, "I'm not precious," and she took one of the napkins and tried to blot the oil, pressing too hard and spreading it, and he reached a hand over hers to still her, and his fingers were warm and sure, like someone who'd spent time learning where to apply pressure to make a bleeding stop. Sabotage, she reminded herself, and the server came and she ordered the most expensive wine by pointing at it with an almost bored detachment. Then once it came she pretended to know far too much about it, sniffing and pronouncing vivid, empty adjectives in rapid succession: unctuous, mineral, brooding, until he laughed again, not at her, but with her, as if her performance were a very small, very thoughtful prank played on the tension that always arrives first on blind dates. "I'm an architect," he said when she asked what he did, and she made a face like she tasted something off. "So you spend your life drawing boxes and putting people in them," she said, aiming for blunt and cruel, for the kind of line that would make him bristle, but his eyes did that thing where they warmed without softening. "If I'm lucky," he said, "I get to draw places where people can breathe," and he gestured with his hands, as if shaping space, showing how a wall could hold a memory, how light could make a room honest, and she felt a shiver run along the scaffolding of her plan, tightening the bolts as if the whole structure were testing itself against a wind. She told him she collected crystals and believed in the curative power of the moon to heal dead. She told him she had 3 ex-husbands and a pet ferret that hated men. She told him she had a side hustle selling counterfeit handbags and an even worse side hustle teaching those ferrets to pick locks, and through it he listened, eyes crinkling when she wanted them to harden, and when the server set down a plate of burrito between them he took the first bite and closed his eyes in a way that was both unguarded and reverent, as if he'd just been reminded that civility had a texture and it was creamy and drizzled with peppered oil. She tried to stoke an argument over the menu, insisted on talking about anchovies as if they were a moral question, and he took the bait and smiled through it, meeting her escalation with curiosity. "Convince me," he said, and leaned forward, elbows on the table like a boy at a secret, and she heard herself giving a speech that began as satire and became a confession about bitterness and appetite and learning to like the things that are small and intense because you grew up in a house where you were scared of anything with a big, obvious flavor. Somewhere in there she stopped playing a role, not out of choice but gravity, the truth finding a path of least resistance through the flimsy obstacle course she'd set up, and when she reached for her glass, his hand was there too, and their fingers touched for a second longer than courtesy, and she pulled back as if burned, a flush rising that had nothing to do with wine. "What brought you here?" she asked too quickly, and he glanced out the window, the neon sign across the street making a red river across his cheek. "A friend," he said. "He signed me up for a matching thing, told me I needed to meet someone who would tell me the truth before I asked for it," and he laughed, then went quiet. "My dad got sick last year, early onset, the kind that takes the light bulbs first and then the wiring, and it was like watching a house you grew up in collapse very slowly from the inside, one room at a time. For months I thought I was the only person sinking, like grief made a solitary planet and I'd been exiled there as a joke, and then one day, in the hospital, a nurse laughed at my terrible joke in a way that made me think, there are still doors somewhere, I just have to find them," and he shrugged with a practiced nonchalance that fooled neither of them. She felt the part of her that had accepted the 50 shift under the weight of his gentleness, and she glanced past him to the mirror behind the bar where the room doubled and doubled again, the version of herself in each reflection a little blurry or a little braver depending on the angle, and she almost said, "I'm not who you think I am, but the room's warmth held her there in the fiction, the kind every good lie requires, and she heard her own voice talking about photography, about the way she liked to catch people in windows, believing they were alone, that puddles made better portraits than cameras because they understood distortion. He told her about a bridge he designed by the river, how he hid a small bench under a canopy of steel that no one would notice unless they were looking for shade. It's a place you can sit and watch the city breathe, he said. No one knows it's mine, and the pride there was the same as a child's when they show you a seashell and expect you to see in it the entire ocean. By the time the check came, her sabotage had evaporated like steam off pasta, and something else had settled in, something that made her sit back as if to see the whole of him at once, the way his hair had a stubborn curl near his temple, the way his wrist had a pale stripe where a watch must usually rest, the way his smile was never full unless he was looking at something besides her, which made her want to give him things worth looking at, and she should have told him then. She should have emptied her pockets onto the table and let the money sit there like a confession, but she didn't, and maybe that was the true sabotage, the one against herself, the real blind date Maya. The actual Maya never came, as if she'd been edited out of the scene by a director who wanted a tighter story, but the night kept widening around them anyway, and when they stepped back out under the dripping awning, he handed her his umbrella and walked in the rain beside her, hair darkening and plastering to his forehead, the street lights painting everyone wet gold. And she was laughing, and he was telling her how once he had fallen asleep on the subway and woken up at the end of the line with 10 text messages from his sister and one from a number he didn't recognize that said simply, "You looked peaceful," and it felt like fate was a series of small, harmless accidents that only made sense in reverse. At the corner she turned toward the subway and he toward the bus stop, and they lingered with that awkward, glowing span of silence where two people decide what kind of story they want to write next, and he said, "Would you another night, when it's not Tuesday," and his mouth made the word dinner in a way that sounded like mercy, and she, who could have said anything, said, yes, and felt something inside her both fall and land, like a bird deciding that a human wrist was steady enough to rest on. The universe, because it is both clever and mean, waited until that precise flicker of happiness to set the traps spring. Rena arrived as if pushed on stage by timing itself, hair perfect, coat swinging open like a curtain. Well, she said, voice sugared and sharpened, "I didn't think you'd actually do it, Mara," and the way she said the name made it sound like something you could put on and take off, and Mara felt her stomach drop as if the elevator cable had just snapped and all the floors were growing toward her at once, and Julian's face, the face that had been half rain, half lamplight, drained as he assembled the pieces. His eyes going from Mara's face to Rena's to the street and back, and he said, not loudly, but cleanly, like an architect naming a fault in a structure, "Do what?" And Rena, delighted to finally be the audience and the performer at the same time, said, "She took $50 to ruin your night, babe. I thought maybe you deserved a little chaos," and she laughed, but there was a knife in it, and suddenly the whole evening rearranged itself in Julian's mind. Jokes turned into traps, glances into bait, and Mara couldn't find her voice, which had been so busy earlier pretending to be brave, and when she did, it was a small, unbeautiful, "It's not like that," and he lifted a palm as if to slow the world. "It seems exactly like that," he said, and in his eyes was not fury that might have given her something to push against, but something worse, weariness, the kind that comes when your hope has been proven foolish in a way that is both predictable and expensive, the way a bridge fails not in the windstorm but on a quiet midnight because a single bolt wasn't tightened the day it was installed. She reached for the pocket where the money sat like a hot coal and pulled it out. "Here," she said, thrusting it at Rena, "take it back," and Rena, who had wanted to keep her hands clean of all visible guilt, recoiled as if the paper might stain her skin. "No refunds," she said, as if it were a boutique policy, and grinned, slipping into a taxi and vanishing before the street could decide whether to swallow her, and they were left in the wash of the tail lights, two silhouettes drawn with the same red line. "Julian," Mara began, but his name in her mouth sounded like a lie now, and he shook his head once, enough to make the rain break off his eyelashes. "I hope you got what you needed," he said, not cruelly, just with the quiet intent of someone closing a book at the end of a chapter, and he walked away down the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders gathered. Like a storm in reverse, she stood under the awning until the rain slowed to a mist that turned every street lamp into a planet, and only when the cold got into her sleeves did she move, taking the subway home with the 50 still burning a circle on her palm like a brand she'd earned and would have to carry until she learned to read it. Shame arrived first, then its cousin determination, and in the small apartment where she'd learned to keep plants alive by telling them stories, she put the bill on the table and wrote a letter on the back of an old photograph, because notebook paper felt cheap and emails felt transactional, and if she had anything to trade now it was the truth written on something that already had an image burned into it. "I was supposed to make you hate me," she wrote. "I did, and I hate that more than I can say. You were kind, and I turned that into a stage. I'm sorry, not in the way people are when they're caught, but in the way that knows a wound will take longer to close because of what I did. If you never want to see me again, I will use the 50 to repay other debts I owe the city, which are many, and if you can meet me on the bench under your bridge, the one you said nobody knows is yours, that would be a miracle, and I don't deserve those, but I learned recently that miracles don't wait for the deserving to get organized." And she folded the photograph and the bill together and put them in an envelope she addressed to his office, which she found not by snooping through Rena's life but by remembering the name of the firm he'd said in passing and looking it up and walking them there herself the next morning, because if she was going to ask for forgiveness she should at least deliver the question on foot. The days that followed were longer than they had any right to be, each hour a taffy she had to pull apart with both hands, and she worked her shifts at the cafe with an earnestness that surprised her boss, who found her refilling waters before anyone asked and wiping tables with a care usually reserved for polishing instruments, and she started leaving $5 bills in the pockets of the coats hanging on the wall by the door, the ones left by regulars who forgot their scarves, because she needed to put more kindness into circulation than she had taken out. On the third day she walked to the river in a drizzle that felt like the sky practicing, and she found the bench under the steel canopy exactly where he'd described it, a quiet stage with the city playing to itself in the distance, and she sat, and she waited, and nobody came, and she went again the next day and the next, and for a while waiting became a way of keeping her promise to herself not to break anything else. A week later, a man sat down at the far end of the bench and opened a paperback, and for a full minute she thought it was him, but when he looked up, his eyes were not Julian's eyes, and she realized the bench had other lives she wouldn't be a part of, and that was okay. Some places you love you only ever get to visit, never own. She did not know that he had received the envelope on a Monday, and gone out for air with it unopened, stuffed into his coat like a secret he refused to hold, and that he had taken the long way to the bus, past his father's old building where he stared for 10 minutes at a row of mailboxes as if the names might rearrange themselves into a spell, before sitting on his couch with the TV on mute and opening the envelope with a painter's knife he kept for moments when precision was a way to feel gentle, and that when he read her letter, he did not soften, but something inside him leaned slightly in the direction of understanding, the way trees tilt imperceptibly toward light. He did not go to the bench because he did not know what she would do to him there, and he needed to trust his own sense of perimeter again before he stepped into any place where she might be waiting with her courage and her explanations and the kind of eyes that could turn a person into a project, and he had been a project enough this year. Time made a stitch, then another, and turned from a knot into a seam, and Mara, who had built her life out of salvage, began to build a new self out of routine and ink and apologies, some of which she made aloud, others to people who would never hear them. She stopped taking money that came with instructions to be unkind, which meant she often had none, and when her mother's back went out and she couldn't pick up shifts at the nursing home, Mara brought her tea and warm socks and stories from the cafe instead of solutions, and it turned out that sometimes a story held as much as a plan. She found a used Olympus camera at a pawn shop where the bell over the door rang too brightly, and she bought it with 3 20s and a handful of quarters, and she started taking pictures of the city's tired kindness, a man at the bus stop making room for a woman's tired feet on his suitcase, a child tying another's shoe, a barista drawing a tiny heart in a cappuccino for a stranger who looked like he might cry. She printed them in black and white and put them in a grid on her wall, and one night, when she couldn't sleep, she stepped back and thought, this is what it looks like when love doesn't know where to go. Early winter cracked and then melted, and the bench under Julian's bridge gathered a patient gloss of snow and salt, and she stopped going as often, the way you stop visiting a place where you once wanted something you didn't get because you need the ache to be more general, less about one person, or you'll never be free. Then, on a Thursday that wore the sky like a sweatshirt, she looked up from the espresso machine, and there was Julian in the doorway of the cafe, not a miracle, not an angel, just a man with a blue scarf and an expression that knew how to be careful without being armed, and the bell pinged and every sound in the room seemed to gather and turn toward him. Waiting, she froze, hand on the steam wand, and he nodded, small, and got in line like anyone else, and when it was his turn, she found her voice had returned to the right size, and she said, "Hi," and he said, "Hi," and ordered a black coffee like a confession, and then he didn't leave, he stepped aside and waited, and when she slid the cup across, he tapped the lid and said, "You sent me a picture," and she nodded, the letter was on the back of one. And he said, "I kept it," and she didn't know what to do with that, so she put her palms on the counter as if bracing for a wave. "I didn't go to the bench," he said, looking at the latte art of a stranger as if it were a map, "because I didn't trust myself to want what you were offering for the right reasons," and she said, "I wasn't offering anything except the chance to yell at me in a quiet place," and he huffed a laugh. "I don't want to yell," he said, and he looked at her fully now. "I'm tired of the sound of my own voice explaining myself to people who arrive with their decisions already made," and she thought, "I did that. I arrived with a whole play and gave him a part without asking if he wanted it," and she said, "I have nothing pre-written, I can make my mouth a place where only the truth lives if you want to meet me halfway," and he nodded, and the room continued to hum and churn around them, a song still playing in a house before someone remembers to turn it off, and he said, "Do you get a break?" and she said, "In 10, and when the 10 minutes slid toward them, she cracked her stiff apron strings and joined him on the sidewalk where the city was practicing being spring even though the air still had a memory of frost. They walked without touching toward the river, and she did not fill the space with apologies, she let the wind do some of the talking, and when they reached the bridge, there was the bench, faithful as a dog, and he sat at one end and she at the other, and the gap between them felt not like a chasm but like a measure they could close if both pushed with their legs. "I thought you were going to make a fool of me," he said, tracing a seam in the metal with his finger, "and maybe you did, but not in the way you intended. I spent weeks thinking I was stupid for believing you, and then I realized I was just lonely, and lonely people believe songs on the radio are about them and that strangers know their names and that the city has hidden messages. So when you smiled at me, I translated it into a language I needed. That's not your fault, but it's not your fault either, and she nodded, accepting the complicated shape of that. I used your life as a canvas for my desperation, she said. I let someone who didn't deserve the power to script my night hand me my lines, and I delivered them and expected the applause to be money and relief. I didn't expect you to be you, and he laughed once, a sound like a single note. Neither did I, he said, and she told him about her mother's hands, blistered from lifting, how she polished spoons on Sundays because it comforted her to turn something dull bright again, how Mara's father was a season that had passed before she learned the months, and how she sometimes looked at her own face in the mirror and saw all the women in her family making the same choice to keep going on 2 hours less sleep than was kind. He told her about his dad, about the day he forgot his own son's birthday and how they ate cake with candles that had no meaning except that cakes should have candles, and how the only thing that felt real in those months was the sound of the birds in the morning, who continued with their busy, beautiful nonsense as if the world weren't coming apart, and she felt that he was telling her this not to earn anything but to place something delicate between them and say, we could share this if we're careful. The wind picked up and pushed her hair across her mouth. And she laughed, catching it, and the sun moved behind a cloud, dimming the water until it looked like metal, and he said, I don't know if I can forgive you yet, and she said, I don't know if I deserve it, and they sat with that truth like a third person who had joined them, unsmiling, honest, necessary. A jogger went by and a dog tried to smell the secrets in Julian's shoes and the dog's owner apologized too many times and they both said, it's okay, at the same time and smiled, and they minute, then an hour, and finally he said, if we decide to try this, it has to be because there's a we here, not because you're trying to balance the books of your life through me, and she nodded, I won't make you into a ledger, she said, and he believed her a little, enough that when they stood, the space between their shoulders felt less like a rule and more like a margin, and he walked her back to the cafe and at the door he paused, you still owe me for that shirt, he said. And the joke was the bridge's first plank, and she smiled, pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him, rain check, she said, and it was a receipt with a tiny sketch of a shirt and a note, redeemable for one apology dinner of your choosing, with appetizers and no trash magic, and he laughed and said, we'll see, and he went and she went and the city went on being a machine with a heart. The next evening he texted a place and a time, a small restaurant near the park that served food the color of childhood and wine that tasted like grown-ups, and she was early and he was on time and they ordered anchovies without turning it into politics, and when she reached for her glass, she did it slowly, and when he reached for bread, he offered it to her first, and they ate and talked and let the night be less than everything and more than enough, protecting the small animal between them that might be called trust. Later, months later, when summer thickened the air and the river slowed until it could hold the sky without spilling, he took her to a building and led her up a stairwell that smelled of paint thinner and hope, and on the roof was a garden hidden among vents, a patchwork of herbs and cheap chairs and solar lights on rebar poles, and he said, I designed this too, and handed her a tiny pair of scissors, and they cut basil and laughed and put the leaves in a jar of water like flowers, and he kissed her, not as an award for her endurance or an exoneration for her crime, but as a person kisses another when the world has been asked to witness and has nodded its permission, and that night, when she returned home, she taped the $50 bill, the actual, original one, which he had returned to her on the bench, pressing it into her hand with the words, do something better with it, behind a photograph of the river, not to hide it, but to remind herself that money was a story and she was a better writer now. Sometimes, when the light came through in the afternoon, the bill would glow faintly green through the paper and the face of a president would become a ghost in the water, and she would smile and go meet him at the bridge, and they would sit and watch the city breathe the way he had intended it to, their palms open on the bench between them like two halves of a question that, finally, had an answer they could live with.